Welcome back to Policy G Take It From Me. You're here with Susan Mogensen in the Brown Dog Studios. Today we're going to talk about simplicity, other models of governance, and wrap up with a few tips and suggestions for boards, whether you're using policy governance or not. So, one of the things that really attracts me to policy governance is the fact that it is so simple. It is really just comprised of 10 principles. And yes, it takes some learning and some practice on the application side, and you can really dive more and more deeply into it and how it all works over time. But the basic nature of it is very simple. And I think I like this because of some lifetime experiences that I've had, or just, some aspects of my personal nature attract me to this simplicity aspect of policy governance. One thing that pops into mind in my own experience is having worked at the Senate of Canada. And I had this legislative assistant position where part of my job was sitting in on proceedings of the Senate of Canada and also sitting in on a number of committee proceedings. And way back then, I always found that sitting in on Senate proceedings was very, very, very dry and dull. It really is difficult to not fall asleep when you are monitoring Senate proceedings in Canada. And part of the reason was that so much of the content of the debate or proceedings was arguing about rules and the application of the rules of the Senate, which I got to know fairly well over time. But it just makes for a very, very dry, dull kind of proceeding. I used to think that if you took all of the conversation that happens in the Senate, all of the speeches, and broke it down into how much is about process and rules and how much is about thanking or giving a tribute to another senator who is either new or just died or had an anniversary or something. I mean, those two aspects, both the tributes and the process debates, took up the bulk of the time of what I was listening to. I found that very, very frustrating and very dull. I also served as a page in the House of Commons, and that was similar, a lot of arguing about rules. But when they did make speeches, it was also very well prepared canned speeches that people would make. And there wasn't often, I mean, there was some, but there wasn't always a lot of engagement between members of parliament. They would stand up and make their speech and sit down. And what's more interesting is when people start, engaging in conversations and questions and dialogue and debate about good issues. And there was some of that. And there was more of that, I think, in the House of Commons than in the Senate. So just kind of that feeling of being easily bored, perhaps, with some types of meetings, I think had me find the use of policy governance much more exciting because now we can cut to the chase. The rules are clear. We've got all that stuff all sorted. Now we can actually have the good conversations. So that is one aspect of my background that draws me to this approach. You'll also see it, of course, in how Brown Dog Consulting explains things online, like through our YouTube videos and our blog posts. We use those stick figure drawings. And for that, I definitely have to give credit to my sister who pitched the idea because when I was in the early going with Brown Dog Consulting, I wanted to find a way to explain things to people in a way that was simple and accessible and easy for me to do. And I didn't really have all the fancy graphic design kind of skills, and neither did I have the money to pay a good graphic designer to create all the kinds of visual materials that I wanted to create. So my sister said, "Hey, why don't you just draw it yourself?" And I thought, okay, well, that's a simple idea. I like that. So then the stick figure drawing thing was born, and you'll see one of my most popular videos, What is Governance? I think that's where I really started to just draw the stick figures or draw the diagrams in the way that I could sort of see it in my head and that would perhaps, hopefully, most easily convey these concepts to other people so that they could also see how simple policy governance is. My sort of keep it simple approach also lives when we are working with clients. I have often found that clients will make the use of policy governance far more complicated than they need to. And when they do so, they often risk not keeping their eye on the big picture and perhaps risk making things so complicated that new board members cannot just jump on board with the approach. It takes a lot of time for everybody to kind of get to that level of complexity that is sometimes built in to boards approaches. And so I often am cautioning boards to just make sure they understand the principles and apply the principle with kind of the least amount of extra red tape or bureaucracy or forms and stuff that is needed. You can build on the basic approach as you go. So I think of policy governance often as like the little black dress of governance models. You have a very simple, practical approach, and then as you go, you can build on different accessories. You can add the bracelet, you can add the shoes, you can add the purse as you go and use whatever accessories you find are necessary, but keep the little black dress, that elegance always there, and keep your eye on the big picture before getting too distracted with all the little add-ons. So the model itself is simple because it's comprised of 10 principles, as we've said many times. It's the application of policy governance where things can then get more or less involved depending on your board, your patients, your needs, the size and complexity of your organization, and so on. Ultimately, the purpose of policy governance is not just policy governance. It's not to have a good system or a good theory just for the sake of having a good system or theory. It's for flow. You want flow. You want actions to be taken. You want a difference to be made in the world. You want things to move. You want to have time to consider the strategy and the direction and the risks that the organization is dealing with, but you also just want stuff to happen. I'm also very mindful that I'm the kind of person who will have lots of ideas. I'm kind of a very creative person. And the problem with having that kind of dreamer type of character is that you often find yourself dreaming all kinds of dreams, but not making things happen as much as you should. You'll have a great idea, and then you'll have another great idea and another one. You get so jazzed and excited about all your ideas, but then you lose sight of actually the doing part of it. It might be said, it might be a rule that 20% of what we do is the dreaming part, but 80% of the effort is really in the doing. And so, great ideas, great governance models, great dreams, they're wonderful, but they're not really going to make a difference in the world unless you actually get around to the doing part of it. And that can be a weakness for some people, for some boards. And so we always have to kind of keep things in balance. Let's do the dreaming and the visioning and have the thorough, fun, engaging conversations. But then let's also enable the doing of that and not be constantly kind of revisiting the same old conversations we've had a million times before and not creating multiple levels of complexity that are going to slow down the doing aspect. Okay. I hope that makes sense. Simplicity, flow, fun, creativity. For me, that's what this is all about. So, I'm going to take a quick break now, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about other models of governance. You want to make the world a better place, but how? So much to do, so little time. Well, serving on a board of directors is a great way to help create a better world, especially if that board has a clear system for achieving results. Learning how to be an effective board member used to mean reading big books and going to expensive workshops. But now there's engaging online training. The Board Accelerator is a web-based governance course that lets you learn at your own pace and place. Whether you're considering joining a board or serving on one now, the Board Accelerator gives you key insights and the confidence to be an effective board member. To learn more, visit browndogconsulting.com and click Book a Call. Talk soon. We're back. Thanks for being with us on this podcast. We're really enjoying having you. And remind everybody, all our listeners again, that if you have any questions or any topics you want to suggest, please send them in. And I also just wanted to go back to a point I was making about Brown Dog Consulting and drawing those stick figure drawings in all of our diagrams. We've actually had the question from some people, do you do you draw those yourself? It's like, who's your artist? And so I just want you to know that yes, we do draw those stick figures ourselves, or myself. That is actually me drawing those stick figure people. I trust that that's easy to believe. I am I do not in any way consider myself a great artist. Those are just my attempts to try and explain things. And it's probably something that comes down from I remember my grandfather always used to draw funny little stick figure people. My dad as well. Playing Pictionary at our house was a lot of fun. Anyway, so let's talk about other models of governance. Now, I'm being a little bit cheeky here because I'm not going to go into a lot of depth about other complex models or models that have been sort of created by, say, a singular consulting company to use in their practice, but just generally about other models of governance. I will say I actually once tried to change policy governance, if you can imagine. I made a suggestion that we should really add a new principle to the list. You know, there's 10 principles. Let's add an 11th principle. And that 11th principle should be that a CEO and a board chair cannot be the same person. I might have mentioned that before. And had that idea taken root, ta-da, we would have really sort of changed policy governance. But no, that was not a suggestion that was taken because one of the whole points of the simplicity of the model is that it can be used by any organization, any type, any size, in any country around the world. So, okay, but I still am kind of interested in this policy governance plus approach to creating new and improved models of governance. And Carver himself has been really, really clear. And people think, oh, you think policy governance is the only model of governance. Well, we are completely open to somebody creating something better, but so far we just haven't seen it. Carver will say that, he believes so far policy governance is the most complete and conceptually coherent model of governance that's been developed. That's not to say somebody couldn't come along and create something that's even better. I know the International Policy Governance Association, which since became Govern, they also kind of wanted to perhaps continue to want to kind of broaden the tent and invite people into that organization who promote other models of governance. I'm not too close with that organization now anymore, but at the time, a few years ago, they were suggesting that, okay, we will happily include or talk about or engage in conversation about other models of governance as long as they meet these criteria. And I remember I was part of a group that was being consulted on these criteria for, say, new and improved models of governance. And it was really kind of awkward or difficult because every one of those criteria were they were written or created such that it was really only policy governance that was going to meet those criteria. So that was kind of a difficult exercise. I don't know how far they've gotten now. But what I would propose is a policy governance plus approach. We've talked before about how all 10 principles work together, like the parts of a watch is the typical analogy that's made. And so taking out any one of those principles or changing them is going to kind of mess up the whole functioning of the watch, and you won't be able to get the full benefit of the system as it was designed. So for me, as instead of trying to change those principles or say take 5 and then add 5 new ones or delete 2, instead of trying that approach, I would suggest how about a policy governance plus approach? So, policy governance plus no two hat chair CEO could be one model. So we've got the 10 principles, and then let's also include an 11th principle that the chair and CEO cannot be the same person. I pitch that as a new and improved model of governance from Brown Dog Studios. Another one, and this goes back to my sister again. We were hosting some sort of trade show booths at International Policy Governance Association conferences in the past. And one of the things that we would use to help draw people to our booth would be to have some really good gluten free chocolate chip oatmeal cookies. And we called the cookies the 11th principle with the idea that, okay, use the 10 principles of policy governance, but let's have the policy governance plus cookies model where you're using policy governance and every board meeting features, a nice plate of home baked cookies or something. Okay, so that's a little whimsical, obviously, but that would be like the bracelet added to the little black dress. The cookies are an add-on plug-in to what policy governance offers. Another type of policy governance plus model might be like what I've been talking about quite a lot on these podcasts about adding something about facilitation skills or using facilitative leadership techniques at the board table and in, say, ownership linkage engagement activities. So, we're going to use policy governance, plus we are going to be also using the best decision making techniques we can find out there in order to come to our decisions. Let's call that the super board booster 3000 model of governance, basically another policy governance approach. Another governance model, again, this is very, very tongue in cheek, but I recently had the experience with a board that decided they're going to put policy governance on pause for a while. And I'm not 100% sure why or when they're going to come back to using policy governance principles or what they're doing with their policy manual that they put a lot of effort into creating. But they said, let's put it on pause for now. Okay. And it got me thinking, well, if people are really, really anxious about using policy governance principles or they want to look at other models, what would the opposite of policy governance look like? If somebody just, I don't know, there's a takeover of the board and they're all anxious to do the opposite of policy governance, what would that look like? So, just for fun, I created the SAD or SAD governance model, where the S stands for self interest. Every board member is not there on behalf of owners or anybody else. Every board member is part of that board out of their own self interest. So that's the most important thing, is that every board member be selfish or just motivated for whatever selfish reasons they have to be on that board. So that's the S in SAD. The A is avoiding roles and responsibilities, completely not having just don't have any clarity about who's accountable or responsible for what. Avoid any sort of job descriptions or sense of what the board role is versus what the CEO or staff roles are. Just avoid all of that. So that's the A is for avoiding roles and responsibilities. And the D in SAD is for deleting all policies. Definitely having policies is going to mess things up for you if you want to avoid roles and responsibilities, and doesn't really work all that well necessarily with the self-interest component of the SAD governance model either. So delete all your policies. Don't have anything written down. And if any of you have seen The Wire, you know the scene where the guy is taking minutes of, of a meeting that, well, he was harshly told you don't be, taking minutes of a meeting that's involving a criminal conspiracy. So we definitely can't have anything written down. So delete all policies. So that's just my attempt, for fun to come up with an opposite of policy governance type of model. But in any case, going forward, I think if people want to create something that improves upon policy governance, don't strip off the little black dress. That little black dress is perfect. It's elegant. It gives you everything you need. It's useful. It's practical. It's good. It's elegant. It looks good. It's about adding. It's about maybe more approaches that have to do with board members' personal capacity to be the best they can be as a board member. Maybe something that has to do with health, because if board members are struggling with health issues, then they're going to have a challenge in, stepping up and doing what they're supposed to do. That might be the Super Board Booster 4000 model. There's all kinds of ways I think that policy governance, the use of it can be connected to other approaches that then make your overall governance and decision making and your ability to achieve results that much better. But tinkering with the principles themselves, I've never seen that to be coming from like a clear understanding of what those principles mean and don't mean. Some people have tried to change those principles really because they didn't understand completely what the actual principle is and means. And so those approaches I've never seen to be very useful or provide us all with a better model of governance than policy governance itself. If someone can do that, great. Still have not seen it to this day. But maybe the policy governance plus approach is a way to go. Policy governance plus cookies, policy governance plus facilitation, policy governance plus more tools around group dynamics and how we work together as a group. Those are my suggestions when it comes to other models of governance. Everything else that's existing out there today tends to be very steeped in tradition and dependent on the personalities of the people around the board table, and also tends to mix together governance and management decisions. So you're no farther ahead in being able to get more done more quickly because you're always going to have that tug of war back and forth, or misunderstandings or frustration or disconnects between board and staff or senior management or the CEO, with a lot of those traditional approaches that kind of just lump everything together. All right. So that's my 2 cents on other models of governance. When we come back, we'll just talk a little bit about some tips and tricks, provide some advice for boards, whether you're using policy governance or not. Hey, have you ever wanted to make a quick comment, ask a question, or signal something during a meeting without interrupting the person speaking? Reading body language and keeping people engaged is hard enough at the best of times. That's why we designed Meeting Helpers, a visual tool for communicating without interrupting. Each set of meeting helpers lets you applaud someone's idea, let people know they're getting off track, point out a process issue, and much more. Visit browndogconsulting.com to get copies of the original meeting helpers for your board or team today. And we're back. I first wanted to quickly address a question that did come into us from a client about wanting to create an ethics committee and how would that be done for the board. So, my first question is always, well, what's going on? Like, is the ethics concern that you've got related to something that's happening at the staff level or the board level? If it's something that's happening at the staff level, then your first recourse is always to check to see what have we already said and then check the relevant monitoring report to see if we're doing what we said we were going to do. So that's step one. And it could be that the whole situation gets resolved in the normal way, where you detect an ethical problem, you see what we've already said, you check the monitoring of that. Maybe the monitoring report shows that the interpretation doesn't encompass that issue, in which case perhaps it should, and you would have cause to ask for a new and improved monitoring report on that issue. Or maybe you discover in that process that your policies themselves are not robust or rigorous or comprehensive enough or clear enough to address that particular issue, in which case the board would want to look at policy changes or improvements. If the problem is happening on the board side, most of the ethical considerations for board members are contained within a code of conduct type policy and or governing style. And so take a look at those policies. Do they say what they need to say? And are we doing what they say? So it's always that 1-2 step. Step one, did we say what we want to say about this issue? Is this concern covered? And then, secondly, are we doing what we said? So that normal process of kind of troubleshooting any issue might address the concern, in which case I would not suggest creating another committee. But there could be, if you feel like there are a series of more, say, widespread ethical issues that are happening, perhaps both in the operational camp and with the board, an ethics committee could be struck to have a fairly well defined mandate of, say, helping the board with evaluating its own compliance with its ethics policies, or adding some expertise to the decisions around the reasonableness of the CEO's interpretation of ethics committees. So you could have some extra expertise in a committee to help the board with making those decisions. An ethics committee could prepare board education activities about ethics in general out in the world in your particular sphere, or what do ethical decisions look like or not look like within organizations. So there are different things that an ethics committee could undertake, but the caution is to make sure, well, first of all, use the system how it's intended to work first before you create a committee. If you do create a committee, make sure, if it's a board committee I'm talking about, make sure it's helping the board do its own job. In other words, making sure that its policies are robust, that the monitoring system is doing what it should, and that the board as a whole is getting smarter as it goes along. It's understanding ethical issues and where the organization should be, what the standards for the organization should be, and are those being adhered to or not. So try as much as possible to use the system. If that doesn't seem enough and you need more of a team approach or a task force to approach or to do some homework or delve into these issues a little bit more, then yes, definitely a case could be made to create an ethics committee, or to refer a series of well-established kind of mandates or tasks to a governance committee, perhaps that takes those issues on. So that was one question we got about creating an ethics committee. You could, but be clear about it and make sure you've used the system first to see if it can be resolved. The issues can be resolved through how the system works in any case. My second bit of advice, I wanted to share with you a conversation tool that, again, we learned way back in facilitation school. It was originally developed by the Institute for Cultural Affairs, and it's called ORID, ORID. And it's a way for moving through conversations to get to a conclusion. Going back to what I said at the beginning in this podcast about me wanting to have things to be very simple and clear and have meetings be productive. Going to that kind of background or inclination that I've got, the ORID technique is a really good one for whenever you feel like conversations have been going around and around in circles a lot, and where you want to encompass everybody's opinion and good information and think about it and then make a decision. So look it up, ORID. The O stands for objective. So in this approach, say everybody maybe has just heard a presentation or watched a video. You could stimulate a conversation around that topic by starting off with objective questions. So those are questions like, what did you notice? What did you see? What was happening in that video? And any questions that kind of illuminate or highlight the facts. What do you remember? What stood out most for you? Those kinds of objective questions would be the first set of questions that you would ask in this focused conversation method. The R in ORID stands for reflective questions. And those are questions like, what did this bring up for you? What memories were stimulated by watching this? What did this remind you of? What were you kind of thinking from your own experience as you watched this or experienced this thing? So, questions that cause people to reflect on their past and their memories. I personally am a little bit impatient with people who like to spend a lot of time in that R place. People who talk a lot, like perhaps I am right now, but people who really want to say, well, back in 1960, da 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 da. Sometimes that reflection thing can be frustrating for some people in the group, but you do have to go there. You do, because it's important to find out where people are coming from and what is kind of the backdrop to their participation in the conversation. Then the I in ORID is for interpretive questions. Those are questions like, what's the important aspect of what we saw, or what is most significant in what just happened? What is the most impactful, or what's the significance? Remember in school, you'd always get those questions in history class. Well, what was the significance of the Great Rebellion or whatever? So those are questions like that. Like, what is the significance of what we just saw? And then D in DORID is decisional questions. And that is to help bring that conversation to a close. So, what do we do now? What is our decision? What decision should we make based on what we saw or what happened and this conversation that we're having right now? So, ORID was pioneered or created by the Institute for Cultural Affairs, or ICA. It's a very common approach used by facilitators, and just that method of working through those different aspects of a conversation is really helpful because it helps everybody in the group or around the table to participate at the level or around the particular inclination that they've got. Like I said, there could be some people very reflective, some people want to jump straight to the decision, and other people kind of get stuck on the facts of something or the significance of something. Move through all four of those areas to get to a decision, and that might help things go much more quickly, especially if you're encountering a controversial subject or trying to make a policy decision or you ever feel stuck. Try the ORID method. Okay, that's part of our policy governance plus super board booster 4,000, 5,000 model, perhaps, is an approach like that to add on to your use of policy governance principles. So there we go. That's it for today. Thank you all for listening. Again, send us your questions, your topics. Subscribe to our various channels and platforms. And if you want the show notes, go to browndogconsulting.com. Okay. Thank you. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening. Please share this podcast with your friends, colleagues, and fellow board and staff members. For the show notes, choose the podcast tab at browndogconsulting.com. This episode was produced by Brown Dog Consulting, hosted by Susan Mogensen and Rob Ludlow, and edited by Sandra Mogensen. Bye for now.